we're going to go on to our last category, and it looks like we're going to have some good time for questions. Dystopian. The classic dystopian game is Cyberpunk, where human misery, squalor, oppression, overcrowding, corporations that are too powerful, the cheapness of human life, deadly combat, cybernetic arms, all these things are core to the cyberpunk experience. It's a kind of an older system. It doesn't have a lot of the modern things because it is from the 1980s, but I felt like I had to include it because it was such the archetypical dystopian game for so long before other games came along that kind of took on the same spin. Like the Sprawl and the Veil that are powered by the apocalypse, and there are others out there as well. The Resistance, which kind of plays off of the Resistance social game. But Cyberpunk 2020 is very much classic cyberpunk fiction movies. If you want an action-oriented game, Cyberpunk is the thing, because you do outrageous amounts of things that would never happen in real life, would only happen in the movies. And that's really all I have about Cyberpunk. I've not played it extensively. I have read it extensively. But the next thing we're going to cover is a game that can almost be classified under fantasy because it has magic and elves.
Yep.
Or it can be classified under dystopian because it has human misery, squalor, and everything else that goes along the dystopian genre. So I'm going to turn it over to Whitney with some Shadowrun goodness.
Yeah, and honestly, it can also kind of fit into sci-fi just because of your cybernetics and hacking and being able to tap into that. Shadowrun is, it can be so many things. So Shadowrun is a dystopian sci-fi fantasy game that is cyberpunk, but it's cyberpunk with magic and elves and orcs and shamans, and it's like you would think that there's too much in the game. Like if you add in all of these things and you think about how it works and you're like, that shouldn't work, but it does. And you don't quite understand why it does, but it does. But you can be a partially cybernetic Native American tribe shaman in this game that is fighting against an half elf, and that has a bionic arm that has a sword attached to it. It doesn't sound like it should work, but it does, and it's a lot of fun. So Shadowrun has been around since the 80s. It was another one of those very early on cyberpunk kind of dystopian future games. The kind of scary, but the initial Shadowrun world was set in 2050. And it was this super dystopian, futuristic kind of society. Since then, they've changed it in later editions, and I think the year is supposed to be like 2089 or something like that now. Like I said, the game's been out since the 80s. There are, I think, 6 editions now. The latest one just came out in 2019. So this game is still very, very active. There is a lot of lore, but you don't actually have to know the lore to kind of jump in if you want to get into this game. Now, I have played this game quite a few times, and I will say that we've kind of had like themes to the games that I've played. We've had some more of your traditional cyberpunk dystopian games, but we've done some more of our urban fantasy, which focused more on your magical creatures, your shamans, things like that. But hacking and splicing and magic and cybernetics all kind of really comes in. But I will say the Shadowrun game is a D6 based game, and it is very rules heavy and it is pretty crunchy. And I don't want to say it's necessarily combat heavy, but it is very like you have specific skills, you have specific abilities, and you roll to, you say, I want to do something. The GM says, okay, do you have the skill for that? And you build your dice pool based on that skill. It's a little less story building, definitely more rules and crunchy that way. So if you do like a more rules heavy system where things are a little less freeform and a little bit more unified, Shadowrun is a really good game for that. It is a lot of fun. I will say Shadowrun is another one of those games that is kind of easy to break. If you have players that are really good at min-maxing characters, which, as you have heard me talk about, my gaming group is fantastic at. You can give them a game and a system they've never played, and then they will find a way to cheese it and min-max it to the game-killing ability. So you do have a little bit of that in this game, but as long as you're aware that you can do some min-maxing and kind of like overpower characters in certain ways, you can build and adjust your campaign around that pretty easily, especially because it is so rules heavy. So even though they can kind of overpower themselves, you can kind of tamper that down with the rules. I will say it can get horror just because it's urban fantasy. There's a lot of crime. It's a lot of the seedy underbelly dystopian future. So you do have a little bit of those horror elements. In a couple of the games that I've played in, it's gotten pretty dark. And some of them have been pretty open and lighthearted as much as you can with a dystopian game. It is a system that is completely built by Catalyst. So it is a rule system. Shadowrun has its own rule system. It is in the books. Like I said, there are, I think, 6 editions now. For the most part, any of the editions are playable to this day, so you can go pick up any of them and play with that book. But it is its own system. It's a lot of fun. It's a good system to use if like you want to do like an organized crime, kind of like a modern PI kind of game, or a kind of like a sci-fi cybernetic version of like your 20s mob bosses. I've done a couple of games in that kind of genre. It's really good for that. So yeah, it's a lot of fun. I think, hold on. Wait, sorry, I'm trying to read comments. I apologize. Yeah, it is a great setting. All right, with that, I feel like that's kind of it. Has anybody else, any of our other people run?
Yeah, I've played it. I haven't run it except for the Anarchy version, which is the extremely rules light version.
Yeah.
But it is extremely much a simulationist game. There are rules for everything. And the reason there are rules for everything is because people try to break the system.
Yeah.
And there are so many rules out there that try and plug those holes. That's why it's so rules intensive. But just like any system, you can customize it. So if you don't want to deal with these rules, you can kind of gloss over them. So that really comes down to group preference and GM preference.
Yeah, I will say in my experience with running and playing Shadowrun, we have a lot of, we call them house rules. It's like, yeah, we don't like how the book explains that. That's how we're not going to do it. We all agree going forward, this is how we're doing it. Okay, good, move on. So I will say Shadowrun tends to be the game that we have the most house rules on. All right. So then that takes us back to Jason with Paranoia.
Paranoia. It's the only comedy game on this list. It is very much a competitive game between players, because the goal of the players is to make sure that everybody else dies except themselves. And that's not as dire as it seems, because you actually have a character with 6 identical clones that are watching everything you do. So if your first clone gets killed, your second clone shows up, knows everything that your first clone did, and you just change the number on the end of your character sheet. It's set in a far future, dystopian, totally broken alpha complex that is run by an insane computer. And the computer has determined that everything is treason except what it doesn't think is treason. And even then it thinks sometimes that that's treason. If it doesn't make sense, it's not supposed to. It's wild fun, and it just goes in all sorts of directions. And the thing is you're supposed to root out commie mutant traitors. By the way, you're a commie, you're a mutant, and you're a traitor. So what you're trying to do is stay alive longer than anybody else and get everybody else in trouble. This is done in the most modern version with cell phones, by having everybody have the GM cell phone. You can start corresponding with the computer in the middle of the game and turning people in without like passing notes or anything. And you can make arguments just on text that this person should be, executed for treason. The computer likes your idea, and they say, permission granted, please fire your weapon. And the computer sometimes intrudes upon your gameplay. It's kind of like the helpful paperclip from Word. It comes along and gives you a tutorial in the middle of the worst times. So if you're in the middle of a firefight, it tells you how to disassemble your gun and expects you to do that right now. Paranoia is a lot of fun. It's been through many editions. The most recent edition is very much player-friendly. But character creation, again, is competitive, because you pick what your character stat is, and then you pass it to the left. And so then you pick your worst character stat, and you pass it to the right. So you're automatically creating tension with your other players during character creation, because you're doing things to screw with them already. And it is a lot of fun. It is easy to get lost in it, in the very much the shoot 'em, shoot 'em, shoot 'em type of game, but you can also play it in a much more slow build, gather evidence, slowly turn in things to the computer to gather up what you want, and play it as a more conspiracy type game. Generally, it's fun, but it's a different type of fun. And a lot of the fun comes from the very much the free-form, fire your laser at everything that moves. And that includes yourself sometimes, because sometimes you have to execute yourself because you've determined you're a traitor. And that's Paranoia. It is wild, and I'm a big fan. And I've had a good time with it every time I've played it. We're going to cycle back to Carolyn, who's going to talk about A Quiet Year.
Okay, so I fought to keep this one on the list because I think it's so different. The Quiet Year is actually a map drawing game, which sounds like that's not a role-playing game. I think of it as like RP light. It starts out with a story that a group of folks, the folks who are at your table, have returned to a place that had been abandoned after a war, but now they can safely return. And from there, you answer questions to draw a map. And everyone at the table contributes to drawing and to creating the map. So it is really fun because you get to see your players' drawing skills. You also get to see what people think are important in a post-apocalyptic world, because one of the big things is abundance and scarcity. So like, what resources do you have in abundance, and which do you have in that are scarce that you think you would actually need? So it kind of creates a tension of, for the game later on when you're answering more of the questions. If something is scarce, when you answer a question, do you need to find that resource? Do you need to create that resource? The game actually has no dice, which you'll find is a theme with me. But it does use a deck of cards, which is a little different. And there are, I think, a growing number of games that are using decks of cards. Each suit for the deck represents a season, and you shuffle each of the seasons, and then you answer questions related to that season. So spring is kind of a time of renewal. So one of the questions is, you see a good omen, what is it? And you just kind of get to create the story from there. The game has a determined end. There are, I think they call them like frost hunters or something like that. The shepherds, the frost shepherds, will arrive at the end of your game. There's a card that triggers that, and that's the end. And the game doesn't really give you any information about what the frost shepherds are, but you know that they're coming throughout the entire game, and one of your goals is to prepare for that. And it's interesting because if you don't know what the actual problem is that's coming for you, how do you prepare? So you really create the story as you go along, and it is very different way of playing. If anyone has played For the Queen, the style of answering the questions reminds me a lot of that. And it could be a really good intro game to play before you go into playing The Quiet Year, to get people kind of into that style of role play. Okay. That's my stuff. And I think Jason's going to wrap us up with Apocalypse World.
Yep. Looks like we are going to have time for questions, about 40 minutes or so, which is great. We can cover any system anybody has questions about. We can go back and explain things in different things. The only thing we ask is, obviously we're in a virtual setting. Be courteous. Try not to cut people off, but it's probably going to happen. I'm going to talk about Apocalypse World. This is the original Powered by the Apocalypse game, and where Powered by the Apocalypse gets its name. You are playing in basically the Mad Max setting in the future, but with psychic powers sometimes. And you can play playbooks like the Battle Babe. And the Battle Babe is someone who doesn't wear any armor but wears skimpy outfits. And she kicks butt, but just because she doesn't have muddy clothes on. And there are all sorts of, you can play gangs, you can have gang minions, you can play like the preacher in town that motivates everybody. You can create your own little society, or you can create your own little war band. There's so many things you can do with it. I have not had a chance to play this, but I have read the book. It has 2 editions. The second edition is the more evolved one, as most editions usually are. But you can download the first edition for free just by signing up on their website, and so you can see it. The other thing about a lot of the Powered by the Apocalypse games is that you can download the playbooks for free. So you can see what the character archetypes are like before you ever purchase the book. So you have kind of a preview of what's going to happen whether it's Dungeon World or Apocalypse World or Masks, you can see what it's going to be a little bit before you make your purchase. The writing is good, as Eric just pointed out. You know, along with Dungeon World, it's one of my favorite books to read just for the GMing advice. It is conflict-centric, so there is a lot of conflict both between non-player characters and between player characters, but it's all done to further the story and the narrative. It is not meant to be an end of itself. It's just something that that's kind of the way it works.